The hall of joining had never been so quiet. Vara stood at the center of it, with her hands folded in front of her, her silver ceremonial robes touching the floor, and tried to look like a princess who was perfectly at peace with everything happening around her. The hall was full. 300 nobles sat in the curved stone seats that rose on both sides of the aisle. Candles burned in long rows above them. The smell of sacred oil filled the air. Every face in the room was turned toward her. And beside her stood a human. His name was Cole Bennett. He had arrived 2 days ago on a standard diplomatic transport from Earth. He was tall, taller than Vara had expected, with dark hair and brown eyes that stayed calm no matter what was happening around him. He wore the formal blue uniform of the Earth Diplomatic Corps. It was clean and pressed, and he stood straight in it. But there were no medals on it, no marks of rank, no decorations of any kind. Just a small silver pin above his left chest that meant he was a senior diplomat. That was all. Vara had read his file 3 times in the days before the wedding. She had wanted to understand who they had sent her. Cole Bennett, 34 years old, born in a place called Columbus, in a region of Earth called Ohio. No military history, no noble family. He had studied languages and foreign cultures at a university, and then he had spent the next 10 years traveling between worlds as a diplomat. His record was clean and solid. His supervisors described him as patient, careful, and good at listening. One of them had written that Cole had a gift for being in difficult rooms without making the room more difficult. Vara had read that and set the file down and thought, they sent me a quiet man with good manners. She understood why, of course. The treaty between the Solhari Empire and the Earth Congress required a human representative of senior standing. It was a diplomatic marriage, not a romantic one. Both sides knew that. What mattered was the symbol, the joining of 2 peoples through a shared bond, something visible and formal that both governments could point to. The man himself was almost beside the point. That was what she had told herself. But now he was standing beside her in the hall of joining, and the high priest was speaking the old binding words. And when the priest asked Cole to take her hand over the firebowl, he did so carefully. Not with the stiffness of a man doing something foreign, but with the quiet attention of someone who had learned exactly what the gesture meant, and wanted to do it correctly. His hand was warm. The ceremony ended, the hall filled with the low sound of her people's traditional blessing hum. 300 voices together, rising and falling like water. Cole stood beside her, and listened to it with his eyes slightly closed, as if he was trying to remember the sound. She noticed that. At the reception that followed, Vara stayed near the back of the great dining hall and watched him work the room. That was the only word for it, work. He moved from group to group with purpose, never rushing, never lingering too long. He used the correct honorific for every noble house without being prompted, something that took her own advisors months to learn. He tried every ceremonial dish that was placed in front of him, including the bitter gray root paste that made most off-world visitors politely set their plates down and look away. He ate it without expression. When old Lord Severin, who was 80 years old and deeply proud of his family's history, cornered Cole near the eastern pillar and began explaining the significance of the crest on his robe, Cole did not look for an escape. He listened. He asked questions. At one point he said something that made Lord Severin laugh. A real laugh, the kind the old man rarely gave. And Lord Severin clapped Cole on the shoulder with genuine warmth. Mela, Vara's chief advisor, appeared quietly at her side. Mela was sharp and practical, and did not give empty praise to anyone. "He is handling himself better than I expected," Mela said softly. "He was trained for this," Vara said. "Many people are trained for this. Most of them show the seams." Vara watched Cole accept a cup of silver wine from a passing server. He took one careful sip, then set the cup down on a nearby ledge, and did not pick it up again. His eyes moved across the room slowly, taking stock of it, reading it the way a person reads a document, looking for the parts that matter. He was not performing. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Every other diplomat she had ever hosted had performed in some way, performed confidence, or charm, or humility, or importance. Cole Bennett was simply present. He was paying attention. He was doing the work of the evening because the work needed doing, without any apparent concern for how he looked while doing it. Around him, several of her younger nobles watched him with the particular polite patience her people reserved for guests who were interesting in a limited way. A symbol, a political gesture made of flesh and cloth and paperwork. They were not unkind. They simply did not take him seriously. Vara did not correct them. She was not certain they were wrong. Over the days that followed, she learned a few things about him through ordinary living. He woke early and walked the palace grounds before the first bell. He read constantly, and from her people's own libraries, not from anything he had brought with him. He was unfailingly polite to every member of the palace staff, from the senior advisors down to the youngest attendants, and he addressed them all by name after meeting them once. He did not complain about the food, the schedule, the temperature of the rooms, or the many small adjustments that came with living in a place built for a different kind of body. He made no demands. He created no friction. He was, in every visible way, exactly what his file had described, a quiet man with good manners and a talent for being in difficult rooms. And then, on the 42nd day of the new year, the breath of Oran disappeared from the inner temple, and everything changed. The breath of Oran was the most sacred object in the Solhari Empire. It was a small crystal vessel, no larger than a closed fist, and it had sat in the inner sanctum of the palace temple for 400 years. The priest said it held a fragment of the first god's breath, the very exhalation that had shaped the mountains of the world in the beginning of time. Whether that was meant literally or as poetry, Vara had never fully decided. What she knew without question was that it was irreplaceable, and that every person in the empire understood what it meant. By the second bell of the morning, the theft had been reported to the temple guard. By the third bell, it had reached the high priests. By the fourth bell, Vara was sitting in her council chamber with a security report in her hands. 3 people had been in the temple wing during the window when the relic was taken. 2 were priests who had lived in the palace for decades. The third was Cole Bennett, who had told the night attendant that he was taking a walk because he could not sleep. The attendant had confirmed this. Cole had passed through the main corridor near the temple entrance, turned, and walked back toward the residential wing. He had not been seen entering the temple itself. A search of his rooms had found nothing. But he had been there, in the corridor, at the right time, and he was a stranger, and he was human, and he was new. Vara sent for him immediately. He came to her study and sat across from her at the low table without being told to sit. He folded his hands in his lap and waited, looking at her with those calm brown eyes that gave nothing away. "The breath of Oran is missing from the inner temple," she said. "The night records show that you were in that corridor last night." "Yes," he said. "Did you take it?" "No," he said. He did not say it with anger. He did not say it with the exaggerated patience of a man who wanted her to understand how insulting the question was. He did not fill the space after it with explanations or with reassurances. He simply said no, quietly and directly, the way a person states a fact they are not worried about. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her, steady and unhurried. "The high priests will want to question you," she said. "I expected that," he said. "I will cooperate with everything they need." She dismissed him. She sat alone in her study after he left, and looked at the report for a long time. The report made sense. The evidence pointed where it pointed. The logic was sound. But she kept coming back to the way he had said no, not with fear, not with performance, not with anything other than simple honesty. And the most inconvenient thought she had ever had sat quietly in the center of her mind, not moving, not leaving. She believed him. She did not know what to do with that yet, so she set it aside, picked up the report, and went to meet with the high priests. The Chamber of Recollection was the oldest room in the palace. It sat deep in the temple complex, below the main floor, reached by a long stone corridor that sloped gradually downward into a coolness that the rest of the palace never had. The floor was white stone, worn smooth by centuries of feet. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, with carved faces. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one the portrait of a soul who had stood in this room and been judged. Their expressions were not angry or frightened. They were simply present, watching, as if they had agreed to remain in the stone as witnesses for all time. Vara had been in this room twice before in her life. Once as a child, when their mother had brought her here to understand the weight of Solhari law. Once as a young woman, when a palace official had been tried for corruption. Both times, the room had made her feel the way no other room in the empire could, as if the past were not behind her, but all around her, watching everything she did. She took her seat in the observer's chair, elevated stone, slightly to the left of the chamber's center, and watched Cole be brought in. He walked without hesitation. The two temple guards who had escorted him from the holding room peeled away at the chamber door, and Cole crossed the white floor alone and stopped in the center of it. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the 5 high priests arranged in a line before him. Elder Davos led them. He was tall and angular, and the silver marks of his priesthood ran all the way from his temples down to his jaw, a distinction that came only after 50 years of service. He had a way of holding himself that communicated without a single word, that he had already decided things and was now only completing the formality of saying them aloud. Behind him stood priests Orin, Feth, and Sula, and at the far end of the line, slightly apart from the others, stood Kara, the youngest of the high priests by 2 full decades, with silver marks only at her temples and eyes that moved carefully over everything. Davos looked at Cole the way a man looks at something he has already categorized. "You are Cole Bennett," he said, "husband to our princess by treaty bond, a human and a stranger to our laws." "Yes," Cole said. "You were present in the corridor of the inner temple on the night the breath of Oron was taken." "Yes. What were you doing there?" "Walking," Cole said. "I have difficulty sleeping in new places. I was moving through the west wing of the palace. The temple corridor was part of my route back to the residential rooms." "You were wandering the palace at night," Davos said, making the words sound carefully unreasonable. "Walking," Cole said again, without heat. "I was not wandering. I knew which direction I was going." Davos looked at him for a moment. "Did you enter the temple?" "No." "Did you see anyone else in the corridor?" Cole was quiet for just a moment, a single breath longer than the pauses before his other answers. Vara noticed it. She saw Kara notice it too. "I heard a sound," Cole said. "I believed at the time that it was one of the night attendants moving between rooms. I did not stop to investigate." Davos leaned forward slightly. "You heard a sound near the most sacred room in this palace, and you did not stop." "I was a guest," Cole said. "I did not think it was my place to go investigating sounds in your temple corridors at night. I thought that was a matter for your own staff to handle." The answer was reasonable. It was logical. It was exactly what a respectful guest should have thought. And yet, Vara could see what it was doing to the priests. The very reasonableness of it was what bothered them, because a man building a false story constructs it from the most believable pieces available, and Cole's every answer was precisely as believable as it needed to be. To minds already looking for guilt, that pattern looked like craft. Davos pressed forward. "You claim to have read about our sacred texts before arriving here." "Yes." "Then you knew the value of the breath of Orin." "Yes," Cole said. "That is exactly why I would not have taken it." "Or," Davos said slowly, "why something with that much value would be worth taking." Cole looked at him. The expression on his face did not change. No flash of anger, no flicker of protest. He simply looked at Davos, the way a person looks at a problem they are deciding whether or not to bother solving. "If I had wanted to take your sacred relic and sell it," Cole said, "I would not have walked past the temple corridor in plain view of your night attendant and left a record of my own presence. I would have been more careful." Silence. Priest Orin made a small sound. Priest Feth looked at the floor. Davos's expression tightened very slightly. Not with anger, but with the particular tension of someone who has received an answer they had not prepared for. And then Kara spoke. "Do you believe in our gods?" she asked. It was the first thing she had said. Her voice was clear and direct, without the weight that Davos used, without the formal cadences of the questioning structure. It was a plain question, asked plainly. Cole looked at her. "I believe that things exist in this universe that I do not fully understand," he said. "I have been in enough places and seen enough things to know that what I understand is a very small part of what is real. I would not say that I believe in your gods the way your people do. But I would not say I do not, either." Kara looked at him for a long moment. "That is an honest answer," she said. Davos moved on quickly. He asked about Cole's movements in the days before the theft, about his contact with the priests and staff, about whether he had any connection to off-world trade or collections. Cole answered every question without deflection, without elaboration, without any of the verbal filling that people use when they are afraid of silence. He answered what was asked, and then he stopped talking. It lasted 2 full hours. By the end of it, Vara's back was rigid from sitting in the stone chair, and her thoughts were in 4 different directions at once. She watched Cole as Davos declared the session temporarily closed. Cole stood in the center of the white floor, and did not look relieved, or exhausted, or even particularly affected. He looked the way he looked after any ordinary meeting, present, attentive, and already thinking about the next thing. Mela was waiting for Vara in the corridor outside the chamber. Her face was unreadable, which meant she had a great deal to say, and was deciding how much of it to offer. "Well?" Vara said quietly. "He did not break," Mela said. "Davos pushed hard in the second hour. Most people begin showing edges by then, small contradictions, moments where emotion overrides control. He showed none." "Some would call that suspicious," Vara said. "Some would," Mela agreed, "but I have watched guilty people in that room. They perform stillness. It costs them something. You can see the effort of it in small ways. In the hands, in the eyes. His stillness does not cost him anything." She paused. "That is not the stillness of a guilty man managing himself. That is the stillness of a man who simply has nothing to hide." Vara said nothing for a moment. They walked together down the sloping corridor toward the palace above. "I want the night duty records examined," Vara said. "All of them, for the past 2 weeks. Not just the night of the theft." Mela glanced at her. "That will take time." "Then we should start now," Vara said. She did not say the other thing she was thinking, which was that she had sat in the Chamber of Recollection for 2 hours, watching 5 priests question her husband, and that during that entire time, not once had she looked at Cole Bennett and seen a man who had done something wrong. She had looked at him and seen someone patient and precise, and deeply, quietly serious about the truth. Someone who was not afraid of the chamber, not afraid of the priests, not afraid of her people's justice. She had looked at him and seen, for the first time, not the diplomatic gesture her government had married her to, but the man himself. She was not sure what to do with that. She set it in the same place she had put the earlier thought, the quiet corner of her mind where the inconvenient things waited, and went to find the night records. The records room was a long, narrow space at the north end of the administrative wing, lined floor to ceiling with the flat data panels that the palace used for all official documentation. Vara went there alone, late in the evening, after her regular council session had ended and the wing had mostly emptied out. She told no one where she was going. She pulled the night duty assignments for the past 30 days. loaded them onto a portable reader, and took them to her private study. She started with the night of the theft. The main access to the temple corridor was monitored by a permanent station, a night attendant positioned at the junction of the main hall and the west corridor. This was standard. It had been standard for as long as anyone could remember. The attendant on duty that night was a young man named Pol, who had worked the night rotation for 3 years. His report was clear and consistent with what had already been provided to the council. He had seen Cole pass through at the third bell plus 40 minutes, heading toward the temple corridor. He had seen Cole return approximately 8 minutes later, heading back toward the residential wing. He had not seen Cole enter the temple. Vara read that twice. 8 minutes. She made a note. The inner temple had 3 access points: the main corridor monitored by Pol, the priest's residential passage, which ran from the eastern dormitory wing, and the garden passage, a covered walkway along the south wall of the complex that connected the outer gardens to a side door of the temple, used primarily for deliveries and maintenance. She pulled the duty assignment for the garden passage post. There was an attendant listed, a woman named Sarah, from the third watch rotation. But below Sarah's name, there was a notation that she had reported illness that evening and required a replacement. The replacement was assigned at the second bell, a man named Tav, from the auxiliary roster. His assignment was logged and confirmed. Vara looked at that entry for a moment. Then she searched for Tav's actual activity log, the record of his movements and check-ins throughout the shift. There was nothing there. Not a gap, not a deletion. Just nothing. As if the entry for his assignment existed, but the shift itself had never been recorded. She checked 3 more times to be certain she was not misreading the system. She was not. The assignment was logged. The shift was not. Someone had made sure there was a guard on paper, and no guard in the corridor. She sat back and let that settle for a moment. Then she kept reading. She went back 14 days in the duty records and read every night assignment for every post in the temple wing. What she found, when she looked carefully, was a pattern, small, quiet, built up over time. 3 times in the past 2 weeks, the garden passage post had experienced a similar problem. An assignment logged, a replacement confirmed, and then a shift record that was thin or incomplete or missing entirely. Each time, the gap had appeared on a night when nothing happened. No theft, no incident. The gaps were invisible on their own. You had to look at all of them together to understand what they meant. Someone had been practicing, testing how to create an opening without leaving an obvious hole. And on the night of the theft, they had done it for real. Vara closed the reader and sat very still in her chair. She thought about Cole, standing in the center of the white floor in the chamber of recollection, answering every question without flinching. She thought about the way he had said no when she asked him directly, clean and flat and without performance. She thought about what Mela had said, "That is not the stillness of a guilty man managing himself." Then she picked up the reader again and looked at something she had nearly passed over. The duty record for the garden passage post, the assignment for Tav, the replacement attendant who had never recorded a shift. She looked at the entry timestamp for when that replacement assignment had been logged. It had been entered at the second bell. Cole had been seen in the corridor at the third bell plus 40 minutes. Someone had cleared the garden passage before Cole had even left the residential wing. Whoever had planned this had not adjusted the timeline around Cole. Cole's presence in the corridor was incidental, a coincidence that had been used after the fact to redirect attention. The setup had been ready before he ever walked past that door. She set the reader down carefully, as if it were fragile. Then she went to find Cole. He was in the guest observation suite, a comfortable set of rooms on the second floor that were pleasant, but not the marital chambers, a distinction that no one had commented on aloud. She knocked. He opened the door and stepped back to let her in without asking why she had come, which was, she thought, very like him. One of her people's history books was open on the desk. She recognized the binding. It was from the Third Age collection, a period of the Empire that most of her own nobles found too distant and complex to bother with. "You are reading our histories," she said. "I find them interesting," he said. "Your ancestors made very unusual decisions during the third expansion. Most historians from my world would call them mistakes, but the outcome suggests they understood something about long-term consequences that outside analysis misses." She looked at him. He said it without showing off, as if it were simply a thing he had noticed and thought she might find worth hearing. "I have been looking at the night duty records," she said. Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, more like a door opening. "I found a gap in the garden passage assignments," she said. "Someone created a clear path to the temple from the south side. The setup was in place before you left the residential wing that night." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." She looked at him steadily. "You know? I found the same irregularity the morning after the theft," he said. "I also found 2 earlier gaps, from previous nights. The pattern was clear once I looked for it." "And you said nothing." He sat down in the chair near the desk, and looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I thought about it," he said. "But if I had walked into Davos's questioning session, with evidence pointing away from me, and towards someone else in the temple, it would have looked like exactly what a guilty person would do. Construct a diversion in advance. And I had no way to prove I had found it afterward rather than arranged it beforehand." He paused. "So I stayed quiet and let the process move forward." Vara looked at him for a long moment. "You allowed yourself to remain a suspect to avoid the appearance of defending yourself." "I allowed the truth to stay where it was," he said, "instead of picking it up and using it as a weapon. There is a difference." She sat down across from him. Outside the window, the Solhari evening was settling into its deep blue, the sky layered with the soft atmospheric light her people called the god's breath. She looked at his face, patient, serious, watching her with the kind of attention that did not demand anything in return. "Who do you think is responsible?" she said. He looked at her carefully. "I have a strong suspicion," he said, "but I also know that suspicion is not evidence, and that naming someone powerful, without proof, is dangerous. Not for me, but for you. If I am wrong, or if I am right but cannot prove it, it damages your ability to govern." She studied him. "You are protecting my position." "I am being careful," he said, "which is a different thing. Your position does not need protecting, but your ability to act when the time comes, that does." She stood up slowly. She did not know what to say, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that the feeling rising in her chest was not political gratitude or diplomatic appreciation. It was something simpler and more difficult than either of those. "I am going to continue looking at the records," she said. "If you find what I think you will find," he said quietly, "be careful who you tell." In the corridor outside his door, she stopped walking for a moment and pressed one hand against the cool stone wall and breathed. She had married a man she thought was ordinary. She was beginning to understand that she had been wrong in a direction she had not anticipated. She went back to the records room and kept reading. What she found over the next 2 days was a thread, thin at first, then thicker as she pulled it. Administrative records for temple maintenance that did not match the physical logs. Supply requests submitted and fulfilled for items that appeared in no inventory. Correspondence between the temple administration office and an off-world transit company routed through a secondary channel that ran outside the standard palace communication system. Small things, each one explainable on its own. Together, they formed something that made her stomach go cold. She was still building the picture when Mela came to her study on the 3rd morning with a careful expression and told her that Elder Davos had submitted a formal petition to the Temple Council. The divine trial had been called. The divine trial was not a proceeding that could be stopped once it had been formally entered. That was the first thing Vara confirmed when she sent Mela to the legal archives. The judgment of the 3 gods was the oldest form of resolution in Solhari law. Older than the courts, older than the written legal code, older than any institution the empire had built around justice. When all other means of determination had failed, or were contested, the accused could be brought before the gods themselves. The gods would decide. And once the petition was submitted to the temple council and recorded, no authority, not the princess, not the parliament, not any court, could withdraw it. Davos had submitted the petition before the first bell of the morning. Vara went to the temple at once. She found him in the outer hall of the complex, standing near the great carved entrance, with two of the lesser priests behind him. He was wearing his full ceremonial robes, the deep blue-black of his rank, with the silver marks on his face, catching the temple light in long lines. He looked, she thought, like a man who had done something he believed was correct, and was now settled in that belief. "You moved quickly," she said. "The gods do not wait on political convenience," he said. "I have found irregularities in the duty records," she said, "records that you are responsible for overseeing." His expression did not move. "Administrative inconsistencies are common in a complex of this size," he said. "They are a separate matter from the criminal question." "They are directly relevant to who had access to the temple on the night of the theft," she said. "The divine trial will answer the question of guilt," Davos said. "It is beyond your authority to countermand." She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady, formal, entirely composed. And she understood in that moment, with complete clarity, what she was looking at. Not a man defending a principle. A man protecting himself by using the oldest and most unassailable mechanism available to him. If Cole died in that chamber, the investigation would end. The story would be written, and the records she had spent 3 days reading would become a buried detail in a closed case. She went to Cole. He was in the preparation room, a small, spare space adjacent to the Chamber of the Gods, where the accused was given time to compose themselves before the trial began. One of the temple attendants had brought him a cup of water and a clean robe. He had not changed into the robe. He was sitting on the plain bench in his diplomatic uniform, looking at the floor with an expression of quiet concentration. He looked up when she came in. The attendant stepped out and gave them a moment. "You know what this trial is," she said. "Yes," he said. "I read about it in the history books. The accused enters the chamber alone. The gods determine the verdict. Those who are found unworthy do not come back out." "No human has ever undergone this trial," she said. "No human has ever come out of that chamber." "I know," he said. "Then you understand what they are doing," she said. "Davos is using this to close the investigation before it finds what I have already begun to find." Cole looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "I understand that." She sat down on the bench beside him, not across from him, but beside him, closer than formality required. "I can try to delay it," she said. "I can call an emergency council session. I can challenge the procedural." "You will not succeed in time," he said gently. "And if you challenge it and fail, it will look as if you interfered in divine law to protect a guilty husband. That damages you in ways that last long after today." "I do not care about that," she said. Not with surprise, with something warmer than surprise, something that had been building quietly behind those calm brown eyes for weeks. "Vara," he said, and it was the first time he had ever said her name without a title. "I need you to trust me." She looked at him. "You are asking me to let them take you into that chamber. I am asking you to trust that when this is over, the truth will be standing," he said. "All of it." She did not understand what he meant. She wanted to ask him, but the temple attendant appeared in the doorway and said quietly that it was time. And Cole stood up, calmly, without rushing, without looking back at the bench as if he wished he were still sitting on it, and followed the attendant out. Vara sat in the empty preparation room for a moment. Then she stood up and walked to the outer corridor to wait. The corridor outside the Chamber of the Gods was wide and high-ceilinged, lit by long rows of oil lamps in iron brackets along the walls. 5 high priests, were arranged in a formal line before the sealed door, facing the chamber, with their hands folded and their eyes forward. The door itself was black stone, ancient, worn at the edges, carved with the three faces of the gods, Orin the Shaper, whose expression was stern, Veth the Keeper, whose expression was still, Sael the Witness, whose expression was, as it had always been, unreadable. Cole entered the chamber. The door closed behind him. The sound of the latch engaging echoed in the corridor, and then faded, and there was nothing left but silence. Mela was at Vara's side. They did not speak. There was nothing useful to say, and both of them understood that. The minutes passed. The oil lamps burned steadily. The carved faces on the door looked out at the corridor the way they always had. The 5 priests stood without moving. Priest Orin had his eyes closed. Priest Feth's hands were pressed together. Priest Sula was watching the door with an expression that had moved slowly from formal solemnity into something that looked around the edges like genuine uncertainty. Only Kara was different. She was watching the door too, but her expression was not uncertain. It was focused, as if she were listening to something no one else could quite hear. Vara counted the minutes in her head, 10, then 20, then 40. An hour passed. The lamps needed no adjustment. They had been filled for the night. The corridor was completely still. Vara did not sit. She stood with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and looked at the black stone door, and refused, with every quiet act of will she had, to think about the alternative. Then, at 1 hour and 11 minutes, she would remember the exact length of it for the rest of her life. She heard a sound. Not from behind the door. The door was completely silent. The sound was the door itself, the latch from the inside, disengaging. A single clean movement, unhurried, deliberate. The door opened. Cole stepped through. He was unharmed. He was in the same uniform he had been wearing when he entered, unchanged and undamaged. He walked out of the chamber of the gods with the same easy, grounded stride he walked into every room, as if he had simply finished something that needed finishing and was now ready for whatever came next. He paused just past the threshold and looked around the corridor. His eyes found Vara first, and for a moment, just a moment, the composure broke slightly at the edges, and she could see, beneath the calm, something that looked like genuine relief. Then it settled back, and he stood still. The priests had not moved when the door opened. They stood in their line before the sealed door, which was no longer sealed, and Cole was standing 10 feet away from them, alive and unhurt, and they processed what they were seeing with the slow, heavy reckoning of people whose entire understanding of something has just been rearranged. Kara moved first. She lowered herself to one knee. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not performed for the room. It was the movement of someone whose knees had simply decided, independent of any other consideration, that this was what the moment required. Priest Orin followed. He knelt without looking at Davos for permission, then Feth, quickly, then Sula, with a sharp breath. Davos was last. He stood for a long moment, and Vara watched the struggle move across his face. Not the struggle of a man choosing between options, but the struggle of a man whose certainty was being dismantled against his will. Then he knelt, slowly, and the silver marks along his jaw caught the oil lamp light, and looked, for the first time, dim. The corridor was silent again. Cole stood in the center of it, with 5 high priests kneeling before him, and he did not look triumphant, and he did not look surprised. He looked at Vara across the space between them, and what was in his face was a question, quiet and direct, the way everything he said and did was quiet and direct. She held his gaze. She had 1,000 questions of her own, and she could see that he knew it, and she could see that he was ready to answer them, all of them. She gave the smallest nod. He breathed out, and around them, very slowly, The corridor began to come back to life. Nobody spoke on the walk back through the temple. The priests remained in the corridor, while Vara and Cole left. Vara did not look back at Davos. She was not ready for that conversation yet. There were things she needed to understand first, things that Cole clearly understood, and that she now realized she should have been asking about much earlier. She walked beside him through the long passageways of the palace, and the attendants and officials they passed all stopped and stared, because the news moved faster than they did, and by the time they reached the outer courtyard, the entire palace knew that Cole Bennett had walked out of the Chamber of the Gods. The courtyard was quiet at this hour. The silver-leaf tree near the south wall moved lightly in the night air. The benches along the wall were empty. Vara sat on the low stone bench near the tree, and Cole sat beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. She was the one who broke the silence. "Everything," she said. "I want to know everything, starting with what happened in that chamber." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the tree. Then he turned to face her, and she could see that he had decided to stop holding anything back. "Before I tell you," he said, "I need to tell you who I actually am, because my file, the one you read before the wedding, is accurate, but it is not complete." "Then complete it," she said. He folded his hands in his lap. "I have worked for the Earth Diplomatic Corps for 15 years, he said. "For the first 4 years, I did exactly what the file says. Standard diplomatic assignments, junior and then senior level, moving between treaty negotiations and cultural liaison postings. That part is all true." He paused. 12 years ago, I was asked if I wanted to do something different. There is a division, very small, not formally named in any public document, within the diplomatic service that handles situations that standard diplomacy cannot reach. Places where something serious is happening beneath the surface of official relations, where the normal channels have already failed, or where using them would cause the problem to disappear before it could be addressed. He looked at her steadily. "We do not carry weapons. We have no enforcement authority. We cannot arrest anyone or compel anyone. We simply go in and we listen and we wait, and we build a complete picture of the truth." Vara looked at him. "And then?" "And then we make the truth available to the people who can act on it," he said. "Nothing more than that. We do not act ourselves. We do not intervene. We are carriers. That is the word I have always used for it privately. We carry the truth from where it is hidden to where it can be seen." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you were doing here, in our empire, before the wedding?" "The wedding was real," he said immediately, and there was something in his voice that was not diplomatic, something personal and direct. "The treaty is real. The Congress genuinely wanted the alliance. All of that is true." He paused. "But yes, the reason the Congress chose me specifically, the reason my supervisors approved my assignment here, was because of something we had been tracking for 2 years." She waited. 18 months ago, he said, an artifact appeared at a private collector's event on a transit station in the Marin system. It was a small carved piece, third-age Salhari, based on the style and material, authentic. The collector who acquired it was not someone we normally watched, but one of our people was at that event, noticed the piece, and asked quietly where it had come from. He looked at her. The answer led us, over the following year, to a network. Off-world buyers, a transit route running through a cargo company registered out of a neutral station, and eventually to a source inside the Salhari Palace complex. "How many pieces?" she said. The words felt heavy in her mouth. 17 confirmed, he said. The Breath of Oron was to be the 18th. It was the first of what the buyers were calling crown relics, pieces of significant enough value that their absence would eventually be noticed. We believed that the network was preparing to accelerate, to take larger pieces and move them faster, before anyone inside the palace thought to look carefully. Vara was silent. 17 pieces, taken over years, in small enough increments that each disappearance had been explained or overlooked. She thought of the records she had been reading. The thin administrative trail, the supply discrepancies, the secondary communication channel. She had thought she was finding the beginning of something. She had been looking at the end of something that had been running for a long time. "We could not come in with an investigation team," Cole continued. "The moment any official inquiry arrived, the network would collapse inward. Evidence would be destroyed. The source would either disappear or become untouchable behind political protection." He looked at her carefully. The only approach that had any chance of producing a complete picture, the full chain, every connection, every transaction, the buyers and the transit company and the source, was for someone to be inside the palace in a position that gave them access to records and movement without raising suspicion. "Someone like a diplomat," she said. "Someone like a husband," he said. She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze without flinching. "You came here already knowing," she said. "I came here with a strong suspicion, and no proof," he said. "Suspicion is not enough to bring charges against a high priest in any court your people or mine would recognize. I needed documentation, and I needed to build it quietly, from the inside, without letting the source know that anyone was looking." "And the 3 days of the questioning process," she said. He nodded slowly. "I had access to the temple records room during that window, as part of the trial preparation. The priests allowed me to review any documentation that might support my defense. They expected me to look for things that would help my case. What I was actually doing was copying everything I had been building for 6 weeks into an encrypted file on a relay beacon set to transmit on a specific signal." "And the divine trial," she said. "You used that too." "Davos called it to end the investigation," Cole said. "But it gave me one last opportunity to complete the documentation and signal the beacon. By the time I walked through that door, everything was already transmitting." He looked at her steadily. "The full record. 17 missing artifacts, with provenance trails. The transit company's routes and registration. The communication logs from the secondary channel, and the duty records from the temple administration office, including the pattern of cleared guard posts over the past 14 months. Vara was quiet for a moment. She let everything settle. "And in the chamber," she said finally, "what happened in there?" He was quiet for longer this time. When he answered, his voice was careful, not evasive, but precise. "I will tell you what I experienced," he said. "I cannot tell you what it means, because I am not sure I have the right words for it." She waited. "I walked in," he said. "The room was stone, 4 walls, floor, ceiling, no light source that I could identify, but enough ambient light to see clearly. No furniture, no decoration. I stood in the center of the room, and I waited." He looked at the sky for a moment. "And then I was not alone." She said nothing. "I cannot describe what was there in terms that make sense," he said. "Not shapes, not voices, something more like attention. The way you can walk into a room and know that someone is present without seeing them, except this was not one presence. It was 3. He paused. "And they looked at me, not at my uniform or my rank or my planet. At me, at what I had come here to do, and why, and what I actually was, underneath all the things I was pretending not to be." Vara felt something quiet move through her. "And what were you pretending not to be?" she said. He turned his head and looked at her. "Someone who cared very much about this place," he said. "About your people. About whether justice actually happened here." He paused. "About you." The night was very still around them. The silver-leaf tree moved in a slow breath of wind. Above them the god's breath shifted across the sky in soft layers of light. "The priests who knelt," she said after a moment. "They would not tell me what they saw." "No," he said. "I do not think they have the words for it either." "Kara knelt first," she said. "Kara has been watching me carefully since the first day of questioning," he said. "I think she has very good instincts and a very honest mind." Vara looked at him. She is the one who asked if you believed in our gods. Yes, he said, and I told her the truth. You told her you were not certain. I told her that what I understood was a small part of what was real, he said. That is still true, but I have a better sense of the shape of things now than I did when I walked into that room. She turned on the bench to face him more fully. Cole, she said. He looked at her, and there was nothing held back in his face, no reserve, no professional composure, no careful management of what he showed. He was simply looking at her, steady and present and entirely willing to be seen. I owe you an apology, she said. He shook his head slightly. You do not. I do, she said. I looked at you the day we were married, and I decided what you were. I read your file, and I concluded that you were a symbol, a gesture made of paperwork and diplomatic protocol. I watched you in that reception hall, and I thought, this man is perfectly capable, and I set you aside. She held his gaze. I watched you being questioned in the Chamber of Recollection for 2 hours, and I could see clearly that you were telling the truth. And I still let myself say that perhaps the evidence was what it appeared to be, because it was easier to follow the logic than to trust what I was actually seeing. You were protecting your people, he said. That is what you are supposed to do. I was protecting my assumptions, she said. Those are different things. He was quiet for a moment. From the day you arrived, she said, you were paying attention to everything. You learned the honorifics, you read the histories, you listened to old Lord Severin talk about his family crest for 20 minutes because you genuinely wanted to understand. You walked through that reception hall, doing the work of the evening, without needing anyone to see you do it. She paused. I saw all of that, and I told myself it was training. I told myself that explained it. It does explain some of it, he said. It explains the surface, she said. It does not explain why a man with no authority and no protection would walk into the oldest and most dangerous trial in our legal tradition, alone, for a people who were ready to believe the worst of him. She looked at him. Training does not make a person do that. Something else does. He was quiet for a long time. The courtyard around them was still. The palace was settling into its late-night silence. The sounds of the day staff finished. The sounds of the night staff not yet fully present. A quiet window between one world and another. My supervisor told me, when I was first assigned to this division, Cole said slowly, that the work would ask things of me that I had not agreed to in advance. That I would end up in situations that I could not plan for, where the only resource available was whatever I actually was, underneath all the training and the protocol. He looked at the tree. I did not fully understand what she meant until the first time it happened, and by then I had learned something about myself that changed how I thought about the work. He paused. The truth is worth carrying, wherever it needs to go, and whatever it costs to carry it there. Not because someone assigned me to carry it, because it matters, because it is the most important thing there is. He looked at her. Your people's sacred relic was taken from them. The person responsible was someone who had been trusted with the care of this place for a very long time. And for 11 years, it had continued without being seen, because seeing it would have been uncomfortable and difficult for everyone involved. He paused. I did not walk into that chamber because I had a plan. I walked in because the truth needed someone to stand in the room with it, and I was the one who was there. Vara looked at him for a long, long moment. Then she did something she had not planned and had not thought about in advance. She reached out and put her hand over his, where it rested on his knee, and she left it there. He looked down at their hands, then he looked at her, and the thing in his face was so unguarded and so complete that she felt it settle somewhere in her chest like a stone finding its place in water. I did not know who you were, she said quietly. I would like to. You have time. I am not going anywhere. She did not move her hand. Above them the god's breath shifted and rippled, and the silver-leaf tree moved, and the palace was quiet around them, and neither of them spoke again for a long time, not because there was nothing to say, but because for once In a life that had been full of formal words and careful language and the heavy vocabulary of politics and tradition, there was nothing that needed saying. Davos was placed under formal custody the following morning. Vara handled it personally. She went to the temple at the first bell with the palace guard and her full legal counsel, and she presented Davos with the documented record, the complete file that Cole's beacon had transmitted, which had been retrieved and verified by the Earth Diplomatic Corps' legal division before dawn. There were other pieces of evidence too, things she had found herself in 3 nights of reading records in a quiet room. Together, they were impossible to dispute. Davos looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at Vara. Then he looked briefly at Cole, who was standing slightly behind and to the right of her, with his hands at his sides. He did not speak. There was nothing useful to say. 2 off-world transit agents were detained at the port by mid-morning. A warrant was issued for 3 private collectors in the Marin system. The cargo company's accounts were frozen by joint order of the Solhari Legal Council and the Earth Congress Trade Authority. 17 of the 18 missing artifacts were recovered over the following 6 weeks. They were returned to the temple in a formal ceremony that Vara presided over, and each one was reconsecrated by Kara, who had by that point been appointed as acting high priest, pending a full review of the temple administration. The 18th piece, the small carved ring from the Second Age that had been the first item taken 11 years ago, was never found. Vara suspected it had moved through too many hands, across too many years, to be recoverable. She made a note in the official record that it remained missing, and she left a space in the temple inventory marked with its description, because she thought it was important to remember that some things, once lost, cannot be entirely brought back, that the work of repair is real and meaningful, and also incomplete. Cole read the inventory record when she showed it to him. He said it was honest and correct. She thought that was the right thing to say. Lord Severin, who had found Cole so interesting at the wedding reception, made a point of coming to Vara's council chamber 3 days after the story became public. He sat across from her and looked at her for a long moment, and then said, with the particular frankness of a very old man who no longer felt the need to be indirect, "I told you at the reception that he was better than expected. You told me he was trained for it. I would like the record to show that I was right and you were wrong." Vara looked at him. "The record will show whatever the record shows," she said. Severin smiled. "Yes," he said, "but will you admit it to me?" She considered it for a moment. "He was better than expected," she said. "And I was wrong." Severin nodded, satisfied, and did not press further. That evening, Vara found Cole in the library, the old one, on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, that most of her advisors had stopped using since the digital archives had been built. He was at the long wooden table in the center of the room, with 3 history volumes open around him, and a 4th in his hands. He looked up when she came in, and began to close the book. "Do not stop on my account," she said. "I was nearly at the end of this chapter," he said. "I can finish later." "What chapter?" "The final years of the 3rd expansion," he said. "I have been trying to understand the decision your ancestor made at the Treaty of the 4 Rivers. Most external historians read it as a strategic retreat. I think it was actually a statement that the Empire understood where its actual boundaries should be, and chose them deliberately rather than being forced back to them." She looked at him. He was describing a 600-year-old treaty negotiation the way some people describe something they found genuinely fascinating. "You are the strangest diplomat I have ever met," she said. "I have been told that before," he said, without apparent concern. She sat down across from him at the table. He looked at her with the open, unhurried attention she had come to understand was simply how he looked at everything. Not a performance, not a technique, just the way he moved through the world. Fully present, completely himself. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said. "The work you do," she said, "carrying the truth. You said it is what you are underneath the training and the protocol." She looked at him. "Is it something you chose, or is it something you found?" and decided to keep. He thought about it for a moment. Both, he said. I think most things that matter are both. She nodded slowly. And this, she said? Us. What is this? He looked at her steadily. I think it started as one thing and became something else, he said. I think that happens sometimes, when people are honest with each other long enough. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached out and pulled one of the open history books toward her and looked at the page it was open to. It was the chapter on the Treaty of the Four Rivers. She had studied it as a girl and found it dry. She looked at it now and thought that perhaps she had been reading it wrong. Tell me what you see in it, she said. And he did. Outside the library windows, the empire went about its night, the stars clear and distant, the god's breath moving softly across the sky, the palace quiet and steady around them. Inside, two people sat across a table, covered in old books, and talked, unhurried, about history and truth, and the distance between what things appeared to be and what they actually were. It was, Vara thought, a very good place to begin.